Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'd like to call this meeting of the West Dallas, West Milwaukee School Board to order. Um, Sarah, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Lee,
Here.
Ms. Kaiser is excused. Mr. Verbos,
Here.
Mr. Lee,
Here.
Ms. Carr is excused. Mr. Keller,
Here.
Mr. Becker may be here late.
Here.
Ms. Steele-
Oh, there he is.
Oh,
Oh.
Ta-da.
hi, Joe. Ms. Steele,
Here.
President Burns.
Present. All right. So tonight we have a workshop and we're going to be starting with our 2024-2025 audit review. That'll be presented, I believe, by Michelle Walters. Walter, no less. And Aaron, you're going to be joining in on that too? Is
Yep.
that what is? Okay. Let's get going.
Awesome. Well, thank you this evening for having us. So tonight, first thing, we're going to kick it off with our 2024-2025 audit. This is an annual meeting to review the state of, I would say, the school district's financial review. And so with us this evening is, as President Burns said, Michelle Walters, Senior Manager at Baker Tilly, and also Michael Komsky, our Assistant Finance Manager. So I'll turn it over to Michelle and Mike to talk through the packets you have in front of you and to kind of walk you through their process and any highlights from the audit from last year. Michelle?
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. Once again, I'm Michelle Walter. I'm Senior Manager at Baker Tilly. I've been working with the district for, I think we talked about, might be our sixth audit, so very familiar with the district. And I will be going over a very high-level summary of kind of the audit that took place for June 30th, 2025. Some high-level financial numbers, and then kind of any additional information or questions as they come up. So I know everyone has several packets or documents in front of you. I think there should be 5 in total. And there's 2 each for West Dallas, West Milwaukee School District and DLVA. So you have financial statements as well as the reporting and insights document for those, as well as your report on the federal and state awards. So we'll kind of touch base on all of those as we kind of walk through this. So overall, looking at the financial statements of West Dallas, West Milwaukee, we'll start with that one. But on pages 1 through 3 of that financial statement document is our audit opinion. That's what you want from us as your auditors. And we were able to issue what's called an unmodified opinion on the financial statements. And this means that your financial statements are free of any material misstatements. They include all the required disclosures that are necessary, that the accounting principles are consistently followed year over year. If you're someone who likes to compare last year's to this year's, there's a section in there called emphasis of matter. And there was a new accounting standard for 2025 that related to compensated absences. And really, this didn't change anything operationally for the district. It's just more of disclosures and how it's presented within your financial statements. So we call that out within that opinion. But overall, this unmodified opinion is the highest level of assurance you can get from your auditor. So it's what you want. And so I will say for both West Dallas, West Milwaukee, as well as DLVA, both of those have that unmodified opinion. We talked, one of the other reports that you have 2 of, as well as the reporting and insights document. So this is overall a narrative of the audit process itself and the outcomes of the audit. So we start by laying out, here's the objectives of the audit. Here's the responsibilities of us as your auditors, as well as management as part of the audit process, as well as our approach to how we go about auditing that. One of the items we have to include in here is any internal control matters. And as part of our work during a lot of our preliminary field work, we walk through processes and controls that are in place and make sure, you know, there's minimal risk for what we're doing. If there's a higher risk, we change our auditing procedures. So happy to report that as part of that process, we didn't find any significant deficiencies or anything in your internal control process. I will call out that we do report a material weakness. This is over the financial statements themselves. This is because we prepare the financial statements for the district and DLVA. This is very common for school districts as we live and breathe in financial statements. The district does not. They would do them once a year. So the district has chosen kind of a cost versus benefit for us preparing the financial statements. Once again, very common and consistent to where you've been at in the prior years. We also kind of set forth any other recommendations that come up as part of the audit, and you will see one in the report this year just related to budget reporting. And I know I've worked with Mike for the past couple of years, and there's always been some discrepancies between what's in Skyward for the budget compared to what was approved by yourselves, and just getting them to match up. And I think this was something that we have to work to reconcile, but I think now Mike and team has a process in place to better kind of connect the dots between all of that. So for fiscal year 26, the documentation is there and we should be able to go from here's original to final adopted and so forth. So that was just a recommendation for some best practices there. We also have some required communications we have to have as your auditors. So there's certain items such as accounting policies. If there were any changes in accounting policies, which there were none, short of this implementation of the new compensated absence standard, which, like I said, no operational change, just a disclosure. Any estimates that are included within the financial statements themselves. So pension, OPEB related items, depreciation, we call those out as well. We communicate our independence from the district as part of being your auditors, that we are independent of the district and vice versa. If there were any difficulties as part of the audit, which I'm happy to report, the audit went very smoothly and we got full cooperation on everything. So it was really a collaborative effort and no difficulties encountered as part of our audit. There's also the management representation letter. So this is part of what management provides us, saying all of the information we provided to you was accurate and complete to the best of their knowledge. So kind of another resource that says the information that's in there, we agree with. And lastly, the last couple of pages of this report is it's called two-way communication, but that's kind of our reaching out to you guys. The audit's not once a year. We are around the entire year and things do come up. You know, things come up in February that if you got questions, please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to talk through them. I mean, it's part of our kind of contract and engagement that, you know, we're around for resources. So even if it's just to bounce questions off or talk through things, we're around. One of the separate documents that you have this year is a separate report for the federal and state compliance of the grants. In prior years, this has been included within the financial statements for West Allis, West Milwaukee, but for 2025, based on the timing of when the compliance supplement was released, we had to split these out. So it's just in a separate bound document, but it's the same base information. This is a compliance audit, and we audited 3 federal programs with Medicaid, Child Nutrition, and IDEA, as well as 2 state ones with General AIDS and State Special Education. And of all of those programs, happy to report there were no compliance findings. So everything was good on that front. And then just the last pieces is the DLVA statements. And this follows the same kind of everything that I've talked about with West Allis, West Milwaukee. It applies to the DLVA. It's just a requirement that because of the grant fundings that you've received there, you have to have that separate financial reporting. So overall, a very good position from audit wise. Like I said, it was a very good year for both us working with Mike and Aaron and Jeff and the team. And it was a very effortless process, we'll say. So if we're going to get into high level information on the financials, this is a schedule that shows the budget to actual of the general fund for West Allis, West Milwaukee. And the district budgeted for the general fund to use about $121,000 of fund balance. And when we look at where actuals came in at the end of the year, you actually added to fund balance of about $745,000. So revenues came in at a favorable position compared to budget. And expenditures came in at an unfavorable position, mostly due to increased transfers to Fund 46 that weren't budgeted for of about 600,000, as well as additional costs to cover special education fund. So overall, adding to fund balance of $745,000 up to 40.8 million. Now, this is broken out into a couple different buckets. The first we call non-spendable. So this is about $1.5 million, and this is all your prepaid expenses. So it hasn't hit fund balance, but it's money that's gone out the door. The next is restricted of about $117,000, and this is related to grant carryover monies. So they were given to the district for specific grants that you have yet to spend down. The next category is about $4.7 million of committed fund balance, and this is what the district has set aside for compensation model redevelopment. So that $4.7 million has been there just as a bucket to use for that project, which leaves about $34.4 million of unassigned fund balance. So this is what the district can use to fund operations as needed. The district has a policy that overall fund balance in the general fund needs to be 20% of the Fund 10 or general fund expenditures for the year, and it actually came in at about 34% where it ended. So you guys were in compliance with where your policy sits, as well as a strong position in the general fund.
Just one quick comment
Yeah.
to make. So the variation from actual to budget was the reason why the expenses came in higher was due to the budget amendment process we do in May. So we knew that revenues were a little bit higher, expenses were a little bit lower. So increasing transfers, we gave staff and year-end bonus, things like that are the reason that got up a little higher, and it still left a $745,000 surplus. So a lot of money, but in terms of a percentage of the budget, like a percent of a percent, right? And so the best we can get that to zero is obviously the best case for taxpayers to get increases in state aid. So that's just some background to put a little more color to that. The last thing I'd mention too is the committed fund balance is not restricted, meaning the board can take action to uncommit those dollars anytime. So committed for a purpose, but not locked in for life kind of thinking. So sorry, Michelle.
No problem. So when we look at the other remaining funds of the district, the special education fund is a fund that had $20.2 million of expenditures, and this fund always has to net out to zero. So that's where a transfer from the general fund happens to zero that out. So overall, zero fund balance. When we look at the food service fund is the next column over. $4.3 million of revenue compared to 3.8 of expenditures. So overall fund balance increased about $493,000 up to 2.7 million. Now, all of this is restricted for food service purposes. The capital projects fund is where you'll see a lot of activity, or at least bigger numbers than what have been in the past, with $73.5 million of revenue and $2.8 million of expense. So overall adding to fund balance here of about $70.7 million, but this is all related to the referendum and the borrowing from the referendum. So at the end of the year, there's about $84.5 million in fund balance. Now this has three different aspects that are included in there. You have about $8.7 million that's in your long-term capital improvement trust. So that's your Fund 46 that is restricted for those purposes. There's also about $69.6 million that is unspent bond proceeds. So you'll be spending those down in the future years, but they're restricted for those purposes they were borrowed for. And then the remaining $6.2 million of fund balance in this fund is committed for future capital projects. So a lot of activity going on in that fund that you'll see spending down in the next few years. The community service fund is the next fund, about $9.3 million of revenue compared to $10.8 million of expenditures. So this fund decreased fund balance by about $1.5 million down to 5.5. All of this is restricted for community service programs. The debt service fund is our last major fund, so that's broken out in the front half of the financial statements. $4.9 million of revenues compared to 2.5 of expenditures. So overall, increasing fund balance by about $2.4 million, up to 2.7. All of this is restricted to pay debt. So principal and interest on debt.
Yeah, just, and the reason for that increase was the bond premium.
The last column is labeled non-major funds, and this consists of two funds, which the details of these are broken out on page 59 in the financial statements. But this is your DLVA fund again, and then your gift fund, so Fund 21. Quantitatively, they're not large, which is why they are classified as the non-major funds and shown in total. But $1.8 million of revenues compared to $1.9 million of expenditures. So ending fund balance of about $2.6 million. And you can see DLVA has about $930,000 of fund balance. And then the Fund 21 has about $1.7 million. So that's what the breakout of those two pieces are. Just a couple other information or high level items that are within the footnotes themselves, because they take up a bulk of your footnotes, is the long-term obligations of the district. And at the end of 2025, the district had about 72.5 million of general obligation bonds outstanding, which the increase from this year is due to the referendum debt, but you're well within your debt limit of about 740 something million dollars. There is a net pension liability for your Wisconsin retirement system. So this is all based off of estimates and actuarial calculations with the state, but that is at about 4.4 million. You have an OPEB health liability for the district, and that's about $27 million. And then the OPEB for life insurance with the state is at 2.5 million. Now, all of these are not currently due that you're currently paying on. It's just based off estimates and future payments that could go out. So like I said, there's a lot of footnotes on this information, but a lot of it's kind of informative, and here's this at a screenshot in time. Yeah, you can.
Question about the total OPEB health liability. With the change in a structure that we have for our OPEB long-term, will we expect to see this decrease each year because we've moved from the undefined benefit to a defined benefit?
Yes. I think year over year, we've already seen this past year, it looks like $1.2 million change to the good for us. Over time, we saw that exponentially growing as kind of some of those retirees fall off that plan, and we move towards that defined benefit, as you stated. So we don't have numbers on when we'll see those or realize those changes. But yes, as time goes, I think it was like 4 or 5 years from now, we could see some pretty substantial changes in that OPEB liability.
Yeah, our last actuarial study actually lined up fairly nicely with the comp model in the way we structured that from the committed dollars to last 4 years, the 5th year being like district replacement, almost the cliff, almost to be like exactly when the OPEB benefit that we're paying now would sunset to replace that. Like we're committing dollars for retirees that will sunset into a Medicare space, and then we'll recover those back in the budget just to replace that with the comp model. So actually worked out nicely, I think, in if that all pans out. But that's the last actual study Millman did produce. So
yeah, we're seeing in the general fund to a reduction in those retiree payments every year right now operationally. So I mean, right now it's been 50,000 to like 200,000 this year is the expected, but over time that'll grow as well.
Okay. I just want to point that out because that's obviously a change we as a board have made to try and make sure that our expenses are more reliable and predictable, as opposed to kind of the whims of the healthcare market. And so I think that should be called out here. We don't see numbers here on this presentation, but when you hear a number like 27 million liability, people might worry about that. But I think understanding what that is and the fact that we're expecting that to essentially eventually go down to zero, because once everyone's off the old plan, then they'll be on the new plan, and that's a defined benefit that we know exactly what that will cost. So,
and I think for context, to provide more color to that, Mr. Lee, I agree with you. I think 5 years ago when we started this, that OPEB liability was almost 80 million. And it could have been more than that, just offhand. So it's significantly decreased already, but
Yeah, I had
Yeah.
70 million in my
Yeah.
brain. So,
yeah.
but thank you very much.
Well, that is all of the information I have. If you guys have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them or go through them.
Are there any other questions from the board? No? All right. No questions from us. Yes, thank you for your work and
Perfect.
even it being a small lift that you did, I guess. It's a lot of work, so we appreciate it and thank you very much for your findings.
And I appreciate the district and
Yeah.
everyone for making this an easy process. So appreciate it.
Thank you all. And I do want to shout out the team too. Like it was a group effort of the finance team, the business office, everybody kind of pulling their own weight. So Jeff, Sarah, the whole team. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both. All right. And with that, that will move us to our next workshop item tonight, which is our Teaching and Learning AGR Board Workshop.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for a few seconds for us to get set up. We're excited to be with you and continue the conversation around numbers tonight. So I'm joined with Keith Ruffalo, our coordinator of elementary instruction and oversees the AGR grant, and then Corey Sack, our manager of data, research, and accountability, who supports everything data related. So with this team, hopefully we'll be able to share this important update and then also answer any questions. Let's see, start mirroring. Here we go. Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. There's just a little bit of a lag. Okay, wonderful. So we are going to be talking through the AGR grant, which our goal is centered around data that we get from Ames Web and FastBridge. But our goals that I want us just to point to are really around our school board goals, number 1 and 2. So early literacy and mathematics. So this data that we're going to be looking at is a predictor of how students will perform on forward, and also just shows kind of how are we serving the students best in building their early literacy skills as well as their mathematics skills. So today, our session is broken up into 3 parts. We're going to review the AGR process and the goals we have set as a district. We're going to look at school level AGR data and analyze it with you. And then we're also going to discuss next steps. So actions that are already underway with our team and with the full leadership team. So our purpose today is really 2 main areas. First, this is a progress check. So we always update the school board on our progress towards the Achievement Gap Reduction grant goals at the begin after the first semester and also at the conclusion of the year. This is required by the grant, but is also really tied to our theory of action and continuous improvement work. So this is something that we do and data that we dig into deeply as a team regardless. Second is to just update you all on the strategic steps we're taking and being responsive to this data, what we've learned of the students' progress so far, and then what we're doing the second half of the year to continue to help them grow. I think you'll be really excited to see that across all of our elementaries, we saw really strong and substantial growth across literacy and math, which is really exciting. And this presentation will be focused in on our K through 3rd grade classrooms, which the grant serves. And the data will also show that there's a few grade levels in each school where they're really zoned in and focused in on, given the progress that students have shown so far in the school year. So we'll see that reflected throughout all of our schools as we dig into their data. But there are 3 strategies that we utilize within the AGR grant. The first is maintaining 18:1 classroom ratios. And so with that strategy, the benefit or the impact of that is it really reduces class sizes across the elementary. So with that, we're able to add additional teaching staff, which lowers our class ratios across all of our elementary schools, which is a huge plus. It also allows us to increase opportunity for more targeted instruction support for students. The second that we utilize is instructional coaching. Through this grant, we have an instructional coordinator or coach in every school. That's really phenomenal. Not all districts are able to provide school-based coaches in every single elementary school. So that's something through the grant that we're able to provide. We also use the grant funding for, if we look at one-to-one tutoring, to provide reading teachers across all of our elementaries as well. That is also a position when you look at other districts across the state, sometimes those positions are split between schools. So we do have increased staff, I would say, through the utilization of these three strategies, we're able to really target student learning in a few different ways. And then just an overview of the AGR process, because I know that there's been some questions brought up about this in the past, and this has been shared with you all as a full board previously. But this process is really school-based collaborative decision-making that is promoting well-balanced classrooms with heterogeneous grouping. So another way to think of that is we want to ensure that there's targeted support where students need it. But also it's inclusive and we're grouping students based on strengths and needs. It's collaborative. We have key stakeholders providing input from at the leadership level. They're looking at data and placement of where they would place their AGR sections. And then we're moving down to the teacher level to get individual input on student strengths and then areas where they may need support. And so we're really trying to maximize the staff that we do have available through this grant. And so this is our process kind of expanded out. This is what I've shared with you all previously. And I just gave kind of an overview of it. But what I want to really point to, because I know there's been questions around this, is that this grant allows us to have increased number of teachers, a guaranteed coach in every building, as well as at least one reading teacher. Title I also supports with increasing our access to reading teachers and that instruction as well. And so we really take all of the factors, right, including the data we're going to look at today, into account when we place those sections and then when we place students as well into our class rostering process, which is bullet point number 2. But the idea is that we want to have varying academic levels, learning styles, social dynamics. Heterogeneous grouping is known to be a very strong predictor of student success. So we want to make sure that we have that reflected in our process and in our classrooms. So here is an overview of the AGR classes in each school. So you'll see the school listed, the number of students who receive, who are economically disadvantaged through free and reduced lunch, the grades where they currently have AGR classes positioned, the number of classes, and then the staff allocated. So you'll notice at Mitchell, for example, they have a lower number of students who are economically disadvantaged, meaning they do not have teachers on this grant, but they do have an instructional coordinator and reading teacher. Every other school does have teachers incorporated into their grant. And so now we're going to ground in the goals and then look at individual school data. So the goals look like a lot, but I'm going to summarize it. The first thing to note is that K1 is different than 2-3 because K1 is using the Ames Web screener as their grounding to look at growth. That's a stronger indicator than FastBridge is. So that's why you see a separation between K1 and 2-3. And that's only for literacy. Math uses FastBridge for K1. And then 2-3, they use FastBridge for both literacy and math. So that's the separation. But the key takeaway here with our AGR goals is for students that are more than a year behind in their learning, we want to make sure that we are setting aggressive goals for them and that we're providing targeted and intensive support where appropriate. And so that means our goals for students that need additional learning support is that they grow more than a year within a year's time with us. That's the big takeaway. So that's when you see aggressive growth, that's what we're talking about. When you see typical growth, that means a student who's with us from the point they begin in kindergarten or second grade, they grow a year in that time with us. So a year within a year's time. So our big goal, the aggressive goal is aggressive, right? That's a stretch goal. But it's critical that when we have students who do need that extra support and targeted and intensive instruction, that we're really being able to identify what they need, provide that so that we can close learning gaps so those don't persist as they get into higher grades and into high school. So really want to ensure that students have the most critical literacy and mathematical skills in K through 3. So we're going to start and look at literacy. All of the literacy slides will be orange, and then you notice we'll transition to blue. So that's just, again, if anyone's following along on their computer. So if we look at kindergarten literacy, on track to meet their growth goal. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is we have all of our schools listed on the far left, and then the district score or average is at the bottom. Then the first thing we're looking at is typical growth. For the number of students is the number of students who needed to make 1 year's growth within 1 year's time at minimum. And I want you to remember, if a student is coming to us and they are above grade level, that means they're going to stay above grade level. We want them to keep growing at that rate. A year's time with us is a year of growth. And so typical growth is, again, no small feat, but you can see the percentages of students who are on track within a year's worth of growth. That's typical growth. And then we look at aggressive. We thought it was important to pull out the number of students when we're looking at this, because then you can it paints a different picture when you think about, I'm talking about at Franklin, we're talking about 8 students needed aggressive growth this first half of their kindergarten year. One of them was able to grow at that rate, but 6 of them were able to grow at typical growth, which means they're growing a year in a year's time with us. And so it's important to see both of those numbers side by side, because just because a student is not making aggressive growth yet does not mean that they're not growing. They just might be growing at a rate that we would expect of a typical year. But we know that we want to support students early and often with whatever they need. And so it's also important for our teachers to have in mind, and our administrators, of what type of growth and what are the targeted skills that students need to work on. So some of our key takeaways: overall, really strong on-track percentages for typical growth, pointing towards successful routines and practices related to early literacy. Mann, Mitchell, Walker, and Wilson are all above 80%. The number of students needing to make aggressive growth is the lowest in the kindergarten area, which is what a grade level, which is what we would expect, right? That students coming in, we can all levels are welcome, and we can work with them and support them. But it's typical that in kindergarten, you would have the least number of students who need aggressive growth at this point. And then it also just highlights some additional supports needed at Pershing and Hoover related to K literacy. First grade literacy, again, you're going to see the same tables as we go through K through 3 in literacy and K through 3 in math. But some of the takeaways here for first grade, as you can start to see a little increase of variability with on-track percentages for the typical growth. Irving, Mitchell, Wilson, Mann, and Walker are really demonstrating strong growth. There, as you can see, more students are starting to populate in the aggressive growth area. but also you're seeing a higher number of students that are making that aggressive growth across some of our schools, meaning Franklin, for example, 6 of their 12 did make aggressive growth within that first half of the year, which is impressive. And again, 2 schools and teams that kind of stand out that our team is wrapping around, as well as those leaders are working on already plans in place, are for Pershing and for Hoover. Second grade literacy. In most schools, there are more students needing aggressive growth than typical growth, which is an important takeaway for us as a district. In some schools where typical growth was lower, their aggressive growth was really impressive. So that's something I want to point out. Franklin, Irving, and Jefferson had between, let's look at that, Irving and Jefferson, 52 to 72% of the students that needed aggressive growth were making aggressive growth. So again, we want to see those percentages consistently high on the typical growth side. But we're also noticing that some of the targeted and intensive supports we're providing for students are resulting in aggressive growth for them. Pershing, Walker, Wilson, and Mitchell had strong growth across typical and aggressive growths. And then for students who needed to make aggressive growth, 90.3% made aggressive or typical, which is also something that is really significant. Again, students who, for whatever reason, they could have been with us for the past several years or needed or have just transitioned to us, 90% of them made aggressive or typical growth in the first half of the year. I saw a hand, so I'm pausing. Can I continue?
Unless you want questions right now.
How about we get through literacy and then I can take a question just so it doesn't linger for too long and then we can transition to math. So this is the last point for 3rd grade literacy. Hoover had the strongest typical growth and substantial aggressive growth. Irving had the strongest aggressive growth, followed by Franklin and Pershing. There were overall lower percentages here at 3rd grade, and Mitchell and Wilson are in need of some targeted support for this grade level. And our team, again, has already been in conversations. Their school leaders are well aware and have plans in place to support their teams at their individual schools. So I'll pause there if we want any questions before we move on to math.
Yeah, so for literacy and lots of numbers, do we have any questions for this section before we continue on? Mr. Lee?
Yeah, looking at these numbers going across from kindergarten through 3rd grade and seeing the percent of growth gradually decrease, is that because, I mean, in general, I understand for maybe individual schools that isn't true, but in general, you're going from like between 60 and 80, and then, you know, here at 3rd grade, we're somewhere under 10% for typical growth. So is that a normal thing that you see because there's fewer kids that are needing the aggressive growth, or is this because we're not seeing students from kindergarten through 3rd grade, and this is an artifact of getting kids in at 1st grade and that weren't in kindergarten? Can you elaborate on that at all?
Of course. So I think there's a few things at play. One, when we're looking at this, the standards are going to get progressively more difficult in the skills that they're working on. So that is part of it, right? Where students are like, I also want to humanize this data a little bit. We're talking about young people. We're talking about 6-year-olds to 10-year-olds. And so some of them, as you all, many have children, like are going to grow at different rates, and some are going to accelerate in certain times and some others. So the skills that they're working on are getting increasingly difficult. That's one thing. 2, I will say we do have in some pockets more than others, but a transient student population that sometimes we don't have students with us their whole career. So that's just something that, of course, we welcome all students and we'll work with them. So that's why we have plans in place for whatever they need. So that plays into this as well. I think another point is we have really emphasized early literacy practices with our staff beginning most intensely last year. And so with more professional development and changes on like, this is the best way to teach literacy. And some of that has come through the science of reading literature and research. So that's another area that I would say is contributing to potentially lower. What I hope that we see though, is that I wouldn't want as much variability at typical growth. I would want that to sit. I think substantial growth is when you're hovering in that 40% plus range. Like that to me is accounting for there are going to be individual needs. These are all of our students, right, who have varying needs and abilities. And so I would want there to be less variability within typical growth. What I will also note though, is that we have seen that shift over even just the past year and with focused, targeted, and intensive instruction, and that we are seeing higher levels of typical and aggressive growth across our elementary schools. So it's gotten better just within 1 year of some of the continuous improvement work, including personal support plans, which is what is a result of this data. We have individualized plans for students. So I think there's a few different factors as to why, but as our work as a district team is I want that to be less variable and stay more consistent in the 40 to 50% and above for the typical growth.
And I think one thing to add that I think Alyssa will get to after we get through math is one of the things that when we were talking through this week was my question as I was hearing a lot was like, okay, how does it compare to high level to last year? Sometimes different kids, right? You have third grade graduates out, you have new K4 to kindergarten, but like the majority of the cohort's the same. Kindergarten to first, right? So how many kids are on those support plans? How does that compare to this year? If that number is trending down, you can tell on a high level that we're making progress towards having less kids needing aggressive growth. So I think we'll get to that. That speaks to maybe some of the question you have, Mr. Lee. But it's hard to dive too deep into one grade at one school with one pocket of kids. I think it just shows the specific work the team does to make sure that those classrooms and our administrators and our reading specialists are working with the right kids who need most support to get down to the data that we're looking at. So,
and if I could just add, there are also outliers. And so that's work that our team is strategically positioned to coach and support, both at the grade level, team level, individual teacher level if needed, and then also with our instructional coaches across schools. So there are outliers, and principals are very aware of their data and have plans in place to support as well.
Okay. Do we know how many of the kindergartners were with us for K4?
I don't have that data, but I do know that typically the percentage is around like 60%, that like 50 to 60% that are with us for K4. So there's quite a few students that come to us kind of brand new in kindergarten. And like I said, every year we have new students that enroll as well throughout their elementary and secondary career.
So for me, it'd be interesting to see the cohort of kids we had for K4 and then what their K5 preparation looks like compared to kids who just came to us for K5. And the reason why I think this is interesting is because to me, it could be utilized as a tool to encourage families to enroll their students in K4. Because if you can show an actual benefit, educational benefit to that at that earlier start of schooling, I think that might be a good thing to use. So I know I've asked this before about K4 because whenever I see kindergarten data, I always wonder that because it's not required. You don't have to send your child for K4. And I understand that's a choice that parents can make. But again, the more information that you can provide when those decisions are coming down the pipe, I think is helpful for families when they're for the first time, maybe navigating a school district and sending their kids to school and stuff like, well, what is this really worthwhile? Like, are they going to stay home with me or go to daycare, whatever. So I think that that's something that would be interesting to know. I don't know how difficult it would be to tease that bit of data out, but I think that it could be telling.
Yep.
At least, or maybe there's no difference and it doesn't matter, but it'd be good to know that too.
I think to your point, Mr. Lee, too, I think something we could even, as we work on becoming more and more data literate, I think we could even add, like, for example, this is third grade this year. How many of these kids were in second grade with us last year?
Mhm.
I mean, that's something we could pull and work towards having as just a data point. Not that it would tell a story, but it might just better educate like what we're working with at every school. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at for next year. So.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about growth, we know we do have a transient population. A certain percent of our students come and go, and that obviously has an impact on their ability to learn in our system and all that sort of stuff. And that's not something that any school report card will ever show. But I think that looking at it from those different perspectives can provide additional context to what we're doing here in our district. And so I think that's very important. My last question on this piece is just how many different times are the students evaluated to generate this data?
That's a great question. So this actual data point is their mid-year FastBridge or AimsWeb assessment.
Okay.
Composite. But students who have personal support plans also do progress monitoring. So if they're targeted, it's at a certain frequency, weekly, or if it's or biweekly, and then if it's intensive, it's weekly. So this is one data point, which is also something to consider, right? That we have a lot of other data points that we use to also inform the instruction that we're providing students. But I do think it's helpful. And as I share at the very end, kind of our trend over last year to this year, you will see a decrease in personal support plans. And I think the trend data is important as a district level and as a board, that you're aware that over time, we do want to see that decrease. Despite all the other factors that we can't control, like the students coming in, leaving, different levels and needs. We still want to be able to both provide the targeted support, which I'm very impressed by all of our schools in that area, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but also see that number decrease.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the board for the literacy component? Keep going.
Okay, so we're going to transition now to talk about math on track towards students on track towards their growth goal. And I'm very excited to show you can see again consistently strong typical growth across most of our elementaries, lower number of students needing aggressive growth. Yet also we're seeing, if you notice that in the aggressive growth column, the students that do need it, we're not yet seeing it at some of the schools, like 0 of 8, 0 of 9, 0 of 6. So that's an area for Keith and I to work with our principals on, especially on that more targeted and intensive level for our kindergarten students. But again, really strong typical growth. And smaller numbers of students needing aggressive growth. And then Jefferson and Wilson really demonstrated consistently strong growth across both typical and aggressive, which is a shout out to their grade level teams. First grade math, again, you will see substantial typical growth across 8 of our 9 elementaries. So that's again, a really big celebration. I know K-5 math has been an area that we've all really been pouring into and seeing substantial growth in that typical area across all of our schools, with the exception of Pershing, who we're providing targeted support with right now, is a big celebration. And then Walker, Mitchell, Hoover, and Wilson also showed really strong aggressive growth. So that's also really exciting. I mean, looking at Hoover, you have 19 students who needed aggressive growth in math at first grade, or received aggressive growth out of 33, which is impressive. And then another 9 making typical growth. So again, a number, and this is the combination on the aggressive growth side, almost 80% of those students made at least a year's, right? They're on track to make a year within a year. And so again, stretch goal, we want to be able to provide aggressive growth for our students and make sure we are doing our due diligence to close those learning opportunity gaps that exist for them. But 80% is impressive. Then second grade math, again, you'll notice consistently strong typical growth across all 9 elementaries. That's a big celebration. Walker and Mann had the strongest typical growth as well as strong aggressive growth. And then for students needing aggressive growth, 75% made aggressive or typical. So again, really strong numbers that we're seeing across our second grade, across all of our elementary schools. And then finally, third grade math, Hoover and Walker had the strongest typical growth and strong aggressive growth. Irving and Pershing also had substantial typical growth and moderate aggressive. And then there's a few of our schools and their teams that we're highlighting as needing some more targeted support at this grade level. So something I just want to note now that we've gone through K3 for both literacy and math, I hope you notice that different schools were highlighted for different grade levels for both literacy and math, which is, again, we're seeing strong growth across all of our elementaries, but also our team, our full leadership team is very aware where we're finding success and replicating that across their schools, as well as through vicarious learning across schools. And so very exciting that we're able to celebrate all of our elementaries in that way. And I'm talking about we're doing consistently well. And then there's like pockets where it's like, whoa, that's that team. They're doing something really exceptional there. And so we should take note of those strong practices. So I'm really excited to see that as a district leader. And then overall performance. So this is what Mr. Norris was speaking to earlier, is that if you look at 24-25 and then look at the number of students that need personal support plans in 25-26. So again, students that fall into the high risk category, but really students who need that more individualized support, you are seeing a reduction of students across both literacy and math. And for math, we're already lower than how we ended the year last year. And so again, it's not apples to apples. This is a different cohort of K3 students, but the point of pulling data like this is to look at trends over years. And you want to see the number of students that need that level of intervention and support to decrease over time, because that speaks to our system, that the system's getting better at meeting the needs of our students. Also, there were more students tested, which is another celebration in that data. And so to close out, I just want to highlight some of the work that we've been doing as a district. We, and I know you can't see it because Mr. Becker's video is covering it, but we really have been focusing on defining as a district, what does high quality instruction look like? That's what we've shared with you all before, the adult learning framework. That's where we all said, this is what we expect to see in classrooms. It doesn't matter if your student goes to Hale, Central, Docky, you're going to see these elements incorporated because this is what research is saying is best instruction. So that ELF has been a true game changer for our district in that everyone's 100-day plans, so their continuous improvement planning is focused on that. Our coaching is focused on that. Principals' feedback is focused on that. And then right now, there's some really exciting vicarious learning. So learning through watching, staff watching each other perform and teach, as well as I say perform because it's outside of just teaching, it's also facilitating meetings and for our student services team. So they're having those experiences and then reflecting based on that framework. So there's a lot to celebrate in that. We are more focused than we've ever been. The second, and this is no surprise to you all as a board, because I've been talking about our emphasis on planning and collaborative teams. That continues to be a focus. And if we plan really well and have clarity on what we're teaching and how we're going to check and assess that, then our students also have that level of clarity and around their expectation and are more empowered in their learning. And then third, what we're doing with you all right now, we're analyzing data. Our full leadership team, a big shout out to Corey Sack, because she has done a lot of work with that team over the past 3 years, is being able to really analyze the data, see where we are finding success, and create action plans that are doable and impactful in the short term. So not talking so big, but saying, hey, this is what it's telling us. This is having conversations with staff and being able to make a plan that's really focused. And then at the really micro level is the personal support plans in literacy and math for students. So that's something that we also are you're seeing the impact of that in our data and high levels of growth. So just bringing us back to our continuous improvement work, this is our home base as a district team. And finally, teaching and learning, some of our strategic next steps is we're doing ongoing professional development for our full leadership team. So this is only successful if everyone on our full leadership team feels confident and competent in being able to lead this work in their schools. So when I say full leadership team, I'm talking about principals, APs, coaches. They are getting a lot of learning and support, and then support from our leadership coaches, myself and my team, on transferring that to their schools at a rate that is manageable for their staff, and knowing their culture and what is their area of need to focus as a building leader. Then we're also aligning the coaching cycles, as I mentioned, for Keith as well as Dr. Becky Grease. So they're in full-blown coaching cycles, doing phenomenal work across our elementaries. We're also assessing and assigning additional student learning resources. So that is reading teachers, tutoring services, reading core. We're looking to expand to math core. So trying to bring in those additional resources to support students. And then finally, again, it's data analysis, instructional rounds. So doing learning walks in schools and then coaching feedback is informing our next professional development catalog. And we just launched that. I'm excited to say it's February 15th, 16th. And we have our full catalog available for all of our staff for spring and summer. So I don't want to say no excuse. That sounds too harsh, but people can use that for planning, right? So in the past, we haven't always provided it so early. So providing that both for our teachers and for our leaders is I think really exciting. And I've had several staff reach out to me already today about different sessions. So those are some of our kind of strategic actions, trying to stay focused, but also responsive to the data that we see. So I'll turn it back over to you, President Burns.
Great. Thank you. All right. Start questions from the board on any of this or any of the math components that we didn't ask questions on a pause for. Mr. Lee?
Sorry. Do you know how much time staff are spending administering testing during their day, especially at the elementary level? Do you have an idea what that looks like percentage-wise compared to years past?
Oh, yes. So that has reduced percentage-wise. I don't know, maybe by 30 to 40% over the past 2 years. So we went through an audit, especially with the rollout of Ames Web. And that's part of why our AGR goal changed to use Ames Web, because we found a lot of overlap between Ames Web and FastBridge. And in the end, teacher feedback, our instructional coaches said Ames Web just gives us really more of the complete picture. We don't need FastBridge at the K1 level. At K1, both Ames Web and FastBridge are administered one-to-one. So that is important that we weren't doing both of those. So we reduced that as one example. There were a few other shifts we made with assessment to accommodate that. 2-3, it's a little different because they're able to administer more classroom wide with certain components that have the one-on-one aspect. And so we've tried to be really responsive to staff when they've asked for just a look at our assessments, and it's a continuous updating. Corey, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so we listened to teachers and principals and coaches that came to us at the end of last year with concerns about the FastBridge A reading and A math tests not necessarily being as friendly for our kindergarten and first graders. So we audited at the end of last year and we shifted to the early reading and early math within FastBridge, which are one-on-one assessments. And to the point that Alyssa brought up, we audited again after they had to provide the Ames Web assessment, which was state mandated through Act 20. And then they were also giving, which is one-on-one assessments. They were giving the early reading and early math, which are all one-on-one assessments. So after we got that feedback, we pulled back, looked at it, audited, and went, okay, there are some redundancies, so we can stick with just that. There are 3 separate testing windows where this screening happens. That happens, there's 3 weeks in September, 3 weeks in January, and then 3 weeks in spring. There is ongoing assessment that happens for students with support plans. Research tells us that progress monitoring, which are typically those 2 to 3 minute one-on-one assessments that students get once a week or biweekly, depending on the level of their plan. Otherwise, we've pulled back on any other testing. The progress monitoring happens partly because by law, we have to provide progress monitoring for our PSPs for reading, but we then built our math in parallel with that. And then teachers are giving regular formative assessment, which is just part of the programming with any of the core resources.
Okay. The reason I bring it up is because I'm hearing that it's a lot more than it has been in the past.
Interesting.
And so I think that I'm not saying this is not useful.
Mhm.
This is useful information. But I want to make sure that that staff aren't spending an exorbitant amount of time conducting these things as opposed to the actual instruction pieces that they're really meant to be there for. More teachers, less test proctors, if that makes sense. And so I think that communicating maybe back with building level leadership or whatever about that and making sure, I'm not saying that maybe there's a miscommunication about what needs to be done, or maybe there's expectations that are being communicated incorrectly. And so I just want to make sure that we're not overtaxing our elementary teachers on this because yes, important, but we want to make sure that this important work stays with staff in our district and not staff leaving our district.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think something I wanted to share about K1 and why it's individual is really because those skills, you can't assess that with 6-7-year-olds and a class-wide assessment. Like you have to be listening to them. You have to hear the sounds they know, right? And that's so critical that our teachers know that for every single one of their kids. So I know it's like an investment at these checkpoints throughout the year. But again, also from our family perspective, I would want to be able to sit down with my teacher, my son's teacher, and ask, and like they know exactly where they are and how then I can support them at home. And so absolutely hear you. It has reduced, and but that's a good thing I can bring back to leadership team just to make sure that messaging is out there. I think with Ames Web, and just the Act 20, saying Act 20 gives people chills. I mean, it just stresses folks out. It just sounds heavy and like a lot. But I will say as a system, I think we've kind of calmed some of those nerves and people are in the flow with personal support plans. Those are all like very streamlined now. So I'm really proud of the work that our schools have done. And I do think that they understand what students need very at a very micro level, which I think is important.
And I just to kind of jump in on that, I've heard that as well, Mr. Lee. And I sometimes when I've dove into those conversations, we were at Jefferson last week and we had a group of teachers come for Dr. Robinson's Snacks with the Superintendent. Alyssa, myself, Laura was there. And some of the conversations around that are, I think we're still working on our flow of like, how often do collaborative teams meet? How often are we formatively and summatively assessing? It's beyond just the standardized test. So when we're tested out, is it we're tested out with the standardized test, or is it like we feel like we're formatively and summative? Like it's sometimes a little bit deeper. So I think we're trying to work out like each school, some schools, I bet it's fine. Other schools, it's like people feel like it's up to here. And so trying to work that out, I think it's still a new process to Alyssa's point earlier, but something that we're trying to pay close attention to because we certainly don't want to have staff leaving for things like this. We want people to feel supported, understand why, and know that we're here to listen and pivot if we have to.
Yeah, and that's really my point, I guess, in bringing it up and ensure that those conversations are continuing, because and whenever anything is different or new, there's stress involved with that, and there's a learning curve in what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, and the pacing in which it needs to be done in. But I do think that there should be some more inquiry into that, and then feedback, and then if it is an individual basis as to why this is and what's exactly happening, maybe that's what needs to occur with individual staff members to make sure that they are actually pacing it the way they're supposed to be pacing it and not something else. So I don't know exactly the details behind it, but I wanted to ensure to bring it up here since it's relevant to our discussion here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing it up.
The other question I had is, what resource are we using for literacy right now? What is our curriculum based off of? And what is like the phonics pieces? What is it all based off of?
So Scholastic is our core resource, but across most of our elementary schools are using UFly to supplement and support with phonics. That is out of Florida, and it's the most closely aligned phonics instruction that our staff have been very invested in since they discovered it. And it's very closely aligned with science of reading. So a lot of our schools have chosen to incorporate that into just their phonics portion of their literacy block, but Scholastic is still our core resource.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that Scholastic is not being very useful for the curriculum, and a lot of staff is having to basically create their own curriculum because Scholastic, when we purchased it, Act 20 didn't exist. And so we didn't know what those requirements are going to be. And so if that's the case, I guess my question would be is there support being provided to staff if they're being expected to kind of curriculum on the fly, if you will, versus having something that they can utilize directly out of, I know we spend a lot of money and time on Scholastic.
Yeah. Let me be clear. No, we do not want folks curriculuming on the fly. That is not. We have invested a lot, not just in Scholastic, but also in having our GVC planning guides. So we have defined scope and sequence for learning. So Scholastic is being used across our K-5 elementaries, absolutely, as core instruction. UFly is only for phonics, which is a small portion. But critical portion, especially when you look at K2 literacy. So it's increased time there. But Scholastic is home base and what everyone's pulling their literacy instruction through Scholastic. So again, if you have specific examples of folks to follow up with the on the fly, but we've been doing a lot of intentional monitoring, walkthroughs around that. And so that's not been my experience when I'm in classrooms walking.
And I think, Alyssa, too, to add to that, I think that's really what we're trying to work through with the collaborative teams is at its core, the intent of those are for the teams to be collaborative partners to go, hey, what are you working through this week? What are we doing as a team? And to make people's lives easier. And I think at some time at face value, they can seem like more work. I've been a teacher, believe me, I know what that feels like. But once you get past that and get in a flow with your team, it should be easier. It should make more sense. And hopefully, as we hear those concerns, we're able to address them to actually come and make it easier for them, because that's the goal. Teachers' lives should be easier through the work we're doing as customer service administrators in the schools.
Mhm. And the number one feedback we got from teachers was that Scholastic is very challenging for us to use as a resource for teaching phonics. And so we as a district then invested in UFly and providing that additional supplemental resource for them to use. So that was, over last summer, that, it wasn't the ideal timeline. It wasn't right, but it was what they were asking for. And they said, we are committed to this and you're going to see in our data that it's going to work. So we are, again, trying to be really responsive to what they say is also just easier with phonics instruction. The biggest feedback I've heard is that UFly is really easy to like pick up and teach, right? It's scripted. And I've seen it be really impactful in our classroom. So if it works for students and we're seeing the outcomes we want, I'm okay with that. But we don't want to be creating on the fly, because I also, as an educator, remember starting, and didn't have any curriculum. I was like, wait, what am I supposed to use? And so I think we've all kind of had those moments of pause. Like it just can't be up to the individual. We have to make sure we're focused on grade level learning. And it's hard to do that when you're creating anything on your own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or if that's required for whatever reason, that there's time dedicated to doing
Yes.
that work.
Yep.
So it's not something where it's like individuals have to like the night before, like, oh, I got to teach this. I need to figure out how I'm going to teach that and then teach it. So,
Mhm.
so as long as those pieces are in place, I've heard good things about UFly.
Mhm.
So I think really the question is about Scholastic. And is that the long-term solution that we think we're going to be utilizing here in the district, or with the advent of Act 20, are we expecting that to change?
I mean, for now, I told the elementary team that we're going to look at data and keep assessing throughout this year, right? This is our first year using that more consistent as the main phonics resource. And then we would be up for a review for K-5 elementary, I think in 3 years. So it's not too far off. We'd start reviewing in 2 and kind of see from there and assess if there's some better resources. I am glad that we're in the spot we're in, because a lot of folks not only had to transition with changes with Act 20, they also adopted brand new core resources at that point. So now we have the benefit to look at other districts and where they're finding success,
Mhm.
to look at which of those resources are actually meeting the needs of students. So we sit in kind of a good seat in that respect to be able to have those conversations, and I can talk with directors of where are they finding success with their resources they adopted.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is really important stuff. So I just appreciate the dialogue on it. And so I'm glad to hear the dialogue will continue with staff, obviously, because obviously the buy-in there is super important for this sort of
Yes.
outcomes to be positive for the students. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions from the board? No? One based off of Mr. Lee's comments, are we pushing back at Scholastic to give more resources focused on Act 20 kinds of space so that they do meet our needs for the next 2 years?
Yeah, so Dr. Grease and I have had ongoing conversations with Scholastic for the past 2 years, and have noted, like, here's a gap in your system. Here's another gap. One, we're already in the works of doing, which is creating decodable texts, which are a helpful resource for our students. So we did purchase those for all of our elementaries this year. But they can only move at the rate they're going to move. So they're responsive. I think they're aware of some of the challenges with, and again, I don't want to say Scholastic isn't a great resource. It is. It's just in the phonics area, it isn't as scripted as others. And I think that's difficult when, if you know our elementary teachers, their preps are essentially like 7 in a day, including SEL. So it's a lot to prep for throughout the day. And so sometimes we just have to make some things easier, more direct, so that they could maybe focus more energy towards being, making the comprehension part of their lesson come alive a little differently, right? So, yes, and I think there's still some to be desired with Scholastic.
Fair enough. I mean, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so the more we squeak.
Yeah, we are a little squeaky.
That's
Yeah.
The other question that I had is, you guys said that this data that we're looking at today is from a single time point, right? Their mid-year
Mid-year
evaluation.
screener. Yep.
So one of the ones, and I know it's early and it's young and it's whatever, but the K math with all the zeros on it.
With aggressive growth.
I mean,
Mhm.
and zeros in the still making typical growth. Although for one of them that looks like because most of them are on the aggressive. I guess the piece of this that I would be wondering about is we said that, well, you guys said that we utilize multiple pieces
Hmm.
to evaluate where we're going, but we're reporting on this one out for our AGR kind of stuff here right now. So why are there zeros? If we're watching a lot of our data, we would think that at some point, at least one of the students would be getting there if we're really paying attention.
Yeah, so I guess like let's look at Hoover as an example. So they have nearly 62% of the students, 42, which is also a high number of students that are on track with typical growth. Then of the 11 that needed aggressive growth, one of them got there. And so we're talking about, 10 here. Now that's work that even today we have professional development day that those teams were digging into at the grade level and doing screener analysis, which is a consistent practice now that we have. All of those students will have personal support plans. And again, in kinder, kids are coming in with a range of abilities. Some students have never been in school. And so I hear this a lot from my kinder teachers of like, we have to also have perspective of their learning. They say how to do school, but they're just learning how to like exist and coexist in a classroom setting. And so I'm not making excuses for that, but I think we're just at a point where we also have to realize like that's 11 of, and 42, or I would say 43, including the one with aggressive, are finding success. So again, that's 43 out of 53 that we're talking about. So I know the zeros really like pop out, and trust me, I want every single student to be, on track. But I think it just speaks to the reality of at in those early years, we are going to have students that come in that haven't had a lot of exposure to math at home. Haven't maybe had a lot of like math conversations or practice with it. And so those are just skills that we need to build on. I always say even K2, I'm not worried. I've worked with many students that you invest the time and our teachers are so invested in our kids, like they'll get there. So.
And I don't deny any of that. I just really was kind of looking at why there would be.
Do you have any other perspective you want to add for just kinder as you're in classrooms all the time? Keith?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so this point in kindergarten, so I'm like early childhood certified. I taught second grade and things, and my wife is a kindergarten teacher. And like, this is like, you're absolutely correct in that, like, this is like the turning point for kindergarten of like, sometimes we start to see kids like take off, and sometimes it does take longer, right? And it's like, at what point do you like intervene with the kindergarten student to like intensive intervention as opposed to time and exposure around skills and strategies? So it's like, it is like a fine line where you don't want to make school feel so intense for, a 5-6-year-old. But that being said, so as far as like let's say math resources and things around that, because I do work with that. Like I did for our responsive system, like our core resources, HMH into math. So one of our responsive resources is Do the Math, which we got for this year. And that's really for 1st through 5th grade in a responsive, like more targeted and more intensive resource to like intervene with. So trying to find like, we are looking to see how can we use a resource probably right about this time for students in that don't really meet the criteria for like number core in Do the Math, which is like numbers 1 to 5, 1 to 10, but like more subitizing, like seeing a flash of like dots and numbers and saying, oh, that's 5. That like one-to-one correspondence, like finding something that could really support that outside of even the universal instruction, which the units in kindergarten they started in September and their unit just ended like in January around that topic. So that's an example of like possibly why, like we don't have all the answers, right? But like, so yeah, I would just say that's a good factor too, like more time, more exposure. But now that's the nice thing about the mid-year data, like one data point, but what are other assessments to your point saying like, how is this accurate? Like, or are they actually like in their like common formulas, like you talk about making more progress on these skills? So I don't ever want to like put too much investment in it, but also it tells us something. That's why we look at this, right? So we want to monitor that because it is our like grade level like standard of like here's where we are. So yeah, that's my quick like this is a turning point. So now we know, now we can respond and pay even closer attention to our youngest learners and how they're progressing. So that's really important. So
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was just kind of wondering if this is the best metric for us to be pushing out for this as a reporting piece, because they are very young, and so they might have just been thinking of Bluey at the time and not really gone with it.
I appreciate that. It's difficult with assessments to find something that is going to be, perfect for a grant that covers K through third. But
Right.
It is kind of funny. I have a 4-year-old that I pick him up from school and I ask how his day was, and I very rarely get pretty good. What'd you do? Pretty good. That's about all I get. And so I'll talk to the teacher and they'll say he can do stuff. I'm like, I don't think he can do that. But I think to your point, President Burns, like how often did the student take the one test and they didn't do it, but the teacher's like, they can do that.
yeah,
You know what I mean? That probably happens. So I think one of the challenges we'll have as a team, because we want the board, we want our community to like see the data for real life. And so how do you take all this information now? This is the midpoint, 1 point of time. And how do we add in the June data when we come back and make it digestible where you guys can see it, understand it, feel like you get it? Where's there progress made? What areas were there not? What's the plan? But fully stepping back, acknowledging that this is one data point from 1 point of time, and it doesn't define the kids. It just means this is where we're at. And I'm sure Keith, Alyssa, and Corey go to the schools and they go, yeah, the 0, it's really 8. This kids can, and then there's like conversations happening. So,
and the screener's intention is just to point a spotlight, like, hey, we should pay attention here. There may need additional supports, but those teams, when I tell you all, our leaders and our teachers are like, they are zoned in on what their students need. To me, that's the most important thing. If they know what the students need, then really our work is done. Then the instruction is going to be different. So,
Yeah, again, I don't disagree. I have a 5-year-old at Hoover, so I'm aware. Just kind of seeing where we're at. The other piece that I kind of wanted to ask about is, one of the goals that we have is the inclusivity and grouping students with diverse strengths and needs. And speaking to the point that we do have a transient population, and we have people that are coming in and going. We have students that are shifting schools. How are we doing with making sure that we are having that inclusivity by like seeing where they've been? And I ask this partly because my children moved from Wilson over to Hoover and ended up redoing work at Hoover that they'd already done at Wilson, and that hadn't gotten transferred. That's a couple of years back now, but what are we doing to kind of keep track of our students that are coming in and out? How are we communicating that with the schools that they're currently in so that we can actually group students based on those pieces? And then as another side note, are we doing, and this speaks maybe to the kindergarten math stuff, are we doing any screener kinds of things when the kids come in? And I should know this because I just had one, but I don't think she did anything with it. But like, are we finding out where those kids are so we know when they're coming in, those teachers are prepped?
Yep. So in K4, they have a different assessment. I don't recall the name right now, but it is a 4K on my way. So a readiness assessment, but there's additional readiness assessments. So they do get to see kind of where students are starting. So yes. And I would say what you named as students transfer between our schools, that's something that I'm thinking of Laura, because we just had a conversation about a student with speech services that they were like, I didn't know that they were transferring and they were in this. So that's like an area that I think I wouldn't say is like a systemic necessarily challenge, but an area that we could pay a bit more attention to as students go between our schools. I think as students, though, enter our district, I mean, we have in the enrollment office, there's certain things that get flagged there, right? So if they have additional services or potentially need multilingual support, that will get flagged. Then we do more screening and assessment for that in particular. And also if they have additional services at a previous school. So there are other things that get flagged. But again, I think it goes back to data is only helpful if it actually gives you feedback on what a student needs. And so like, yes, we can do additional screeners and things like that. But at the same time, if a student's coming in between screener windows, I, as a teacher, would really just want to sit down with them and like go through some of my progress monitoring checklists to see like, how are they doing with these skills so I can start supporting them right away. Is there anything you want to add, Corey?
Yeah. To the question about, students moving from one school within our district to another, our GVC pacing guide has really created this universal expectation around using our core resource and our priority standards, which should help prevent those sorts of things from happening. Something that Dr. Robinson I've heard speak about a lot. I know we've talked about when we've seen things in instructional rounds is the ability to walk into one building in February and see a certain lesson or a certain text being used from that resource. And then you go into another building and they're right around the same place in the units. So we've really tried to work as a team to think about the way that we're pacing the teaching so that those kinds of things don't happen. And then I've worked with our coaches in the buildings for systems around making sure that scores get transferred over so that teachers at the new building can also see where a student was in these one-time snapshots that we get from the screeners to try to make sure they have what they need to make those decisions about next steps.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of having a baseline. I know I would expect our teachers to go and interact with the students that are coming in that they may not know about, but just having a baseline piece that you can lean on a little bit to guide where you're looking. Okay, and then the last question that I have is for the one-on-one testing pieces that we're doing for the young kids. Is that just relying on the teacher, or are we bringing in the instructional coaches or other people to come in and help alleviate that load?
Yes. So it's the latter. So our instructional coordinators are in there, either assessing or supporting with the class so the teacher can be in that with students. Our reading teachers are also leaning in and supporting that because that is also really helpful for them to have the perspective on students that may need their support also beyond the assessment time. So yeah, it's a all hands on deck for that. I mean, the windows aren't very long, right? And that's intentional too, so that it doesn't drag on. We can get that done and we can get in the regular flow of the classroom day. So.
But it's not just the teachers that are implementing it.
No, it definitely is. And every school principals are super aware of the weight of it. So they all have their own plans and approaches to try to alleviate that. It could also look like less planning expectations that week together, right? To give back some time in other areas. So.
Okay, cool. Thank you much. Those are all my questions, and I'll reflect again. Anyone else have any questions? All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you
Appreciate
for
all the
having
information.
us.
And with that, that's kind of the end of our space of what we have on our agenda. So if there is no further business and there is no objection, the meeting will be adjourned. There being no further business and no objection, the meeting is adjourned.